Welcome to the Velvet Myth. My name is Adam, and it's so lovely to have your company. Thanks for tuning in. It's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. I do hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed recording all of these stories. And I'd really love for all of you, our wonderful community, to let me know if you like the stories that I've prepared. So, when you wake up tomorrow morning, it would mean a lot if you could pop back here and leave a comment of gratitude for me. Now, before we get started, make sure you're lying comfortably. Relax your shoulders, your jaw, your whole body, and enjoy a couple of deep, soothing breaths, drawing the air in and gently releasing it back out. Now you can simply relax and listen along for as much time as you like, knowing you can drift off whenever you are ready. So, let's begin. The door between the house and the conservatory was an old one, with a swollen wooden frame that required a firm pull to release, and then a deliberate, careful push to close again, without a sound. Ivy had learned both movements years ago. She performed them now by feel alone, her back turned to the lit corridor, the noise of the television in the distant sitting room thinning, and then disappearing entirely, as the latch settled into its keep with a soft, definitive click. She stood still for a moment in the dark, threshold between the two worlds. Then the conservatory came to her senses, one thing at a time. The warmth arrived first, not the dry, central heated warmth of the house, but something closer and more alive, a gentle humidity that pressed against her face and the backs of her hands, like a held breath slowly released. Then the smell. Damp earth and green things. The faint mineral tang of wet terracotta. Something deeper underneath that she had never been able to name and had long since stopped trying to. It was simply the smell of the room. The smell of here. She breathed it in once, slowly, and felt the muscles across the top of her shoulders drop by some small but measurable degree. Rain moved across the curved glass roof in waves. Ivy tipped her head back to listen to it, that particular sound, familiar as anything she knew, the soft percussion of water on glass, that was somehow both directionless and completely encompassing, as though the rain were falling not from any fixed point above, but from the night itself, from all of it at once. It asked nothing of her. It simply continued, steady and unhurried, and she stood beneath it, with her ceramic mug warming her palm, and let it settle over her like a second skin. She hung her keys on the small iron hook just inside the entrance, one of those habits so old it lived in the body rather than the mind, and reached up to pull the cord on the amber lamp above the potting bench. The light came on low and immediate, pooling golden across the worn wooden surface and catching the curved edges of the brass watering cans lined along the wall. The rest of the conservatory gathered itself in soft shadow behind it, the ferns rising in layered silhouettes toward the rain-streaked glass, the shelves of notebooks fading into dark. It was exactly as she had left it. It was always exactly as she had left it. Ivy set her mug down on the potting bench, in the particular spot where the wood had been stained by 100 previous mugs, and reached behind herself to untie her apron. Her fingers worked the knot loose, then paused. Without quite intending to, she tied it again, slower this time, neater, the long cotton tapes looped, with the same quiet deliberateness she might bring to anything that deserved doing properly. The small action settled something in her chest. She smoothed the front of the apron with both palms. Then she looked toward the lower shelves in the far corner, the warmest corner, where the old cast-iron radiator ticked faintly beneath the staging. And there was Fig. He was exactly where he always was, curled into himself on the square of folded wool blanket, one broad paw tucked beneath his chin, his amber and grey stripes rising and falling with the slow architecture of deep sleep. The tipped ear, the left one, creased from some long ago misadventures he had never explained, pointed slightly toward the ceiling. His tail curved around the outer edge of the blanket in a loose comma. Ivy crossed the conservatory toward him, her clogs quiet against the flagstone floor, and crouched beside the lower shelf. She reached out and rested 2 fingers against his back, between his shoulder blades, where the fur was densest and warmest. Fig's breathing did not change. One paw twitched very slightly. Then he exhaled, a long, slow, barely audible sound that might have been contentment, or simply the body continuing its deep work, and was still again. Ivy stayed crouched for a moment, longer than necessary, her 2 fingers resting lightly against his warmth. Everything was as it should be. She straightened slowly, returned to the potting bench, and wrapped both hands around her mug. Above her, the rain moved across the glass in another long, unbroken wave, and the amber light held steady, and the ferns stood quietly in their rows, and the night outside was vast and gentle and entirely elsewhere. Ivy lifted the mug. The steam rose in a slow curl, catching the amber light before dissolving into the humid air above the bench. She watched it go, that small, unhurried dissipation, and felt something in her chest follow it, loosening by degrees. She brought the rim to her lips and took the first sip. Chamomile, a little honey, still almost too warm. She held it in her mouth for a moment before swallowing. She set the mug down and considered the lamp. It was angled slightly too far left, its light falling half onto the shelf of notebooks rather than the bench surface where she intended to work. Ivy reached over and turned the base a quarter rotation, then tilted the shade a fraction lower until the warm circle of light pooled exactly where she wanted it. Across the worn wooden surface, the grain of it visible, the old water stains and soil marks she had long since stopped trying to remove. Better. She stepped back and looked at it the way she might look at a fern she had just repositioned in a window, with the particular satisfaction of something made right. The notebooks were next. There were 6 of them stacked at the end of the shelf, field notebooks she'd been annotating since September, their spines a little warped from the humidity of the conservatory. Ivy squared them against each other and against the shelf edge, aligning them the way she liked, and when she had, she slid one free, the one with the folded corner, the one she had marked 3 days ago, and opened it on the bench. The page held a week's worth of small observations. A note about the tree fern's new croziers, a reminder to check the humidity levels near the north-facing shelf, a penciled measurement of frond length recorded in her narrow, unhurried handwriting. She read it through slowly, the way she might read a letter, and then she left it open and turned to gather the rest of what she needed. The mister first. Ivy carried it to the small utility sink at the back of the conservatory, rinsed it twice, she was particular about this, and refilled it with cool, clean water. She primed the pump mechanism once, twice, until the spray came out fine and even. Then she laid it on the tray beside the pruning scissors and the soft cotton cloth she kept folded in the apron pocket. Everything assembled, everything in its place. Ivy wrapped her hands around the mug again and stood quietly at the bench for a moment, not yet moving, simply looking out at the long green rows of ferns receding into the dimmer reaches of the conservatory. Her shoulders had dropped, her jaw had unclenched without her noticing. From his shelf in the corner, Fig breathed slowly on. Ivy lifted the mister from the tray and carried it to the first long bench where the maidenhair ferns stood in a loose row of terracotta pots, their fronds fanned out in delicate, trembling arcs. She had always loved the maidenhairs most in lamplight. The fronds caught the amber glow differently than they did by day. Each leaflet a small dark comma, precise and still. She began at the left end of the row, raising the mister and pressing the handle in a slow, measured rhythm. The spray came out fine as breath. It drifted across the nearest fronds and settled there, and Ivy watched as tiny beads formed along the leaf edges, gathering weight before rolling to the tips and dropping silently into the soil below. She moved the mister in a gentle arc, not hurrying, letting the mist fall where it wanted to. The bird's nest fern came next, a generous bowl-shaped rosette squatting low in a wide pot near the end of the bench. Ivy set down the mister and crouched slightly to look at it properly. New growth was uncurling from the centre, a tight, pale spiral just beginning to open. She studied it for a moment without touching it. "There you are," she said quietly, "taking your time about it." She said nothing more. It was enough. Ivy reached behind the pot and rotated it a quarter turn toward the lamp so the unfurling frond would lean into the warmth rather than away from it. The terracotta scraped softly against the wooden bench as it moved. She straightened the pot by feel until it sat level, then stepped back and looked again. Better. Her eye caught a yellowing frond low on the maidenhair nearest to her. One leaf among many, but it had gone soft at the stem, past any recovery. Ivy drew her pruning scissors from her apron pocket and clipped it cleanly at the base, then laid it in the small tray she'd brought along for cuttings and debris. The motion was unhurried and entirely without regret. This was simply what plants did, and what she did in return. She crouched further then, bringing her face close to the base of one pot, where a low cushion of moss had established itself between the soil and the terracotta rim. Ivy pressed 2 fingertips to it lightly. It was cool and faintly springy, dense as felt. She held them there a moment, not for any particular reason, only because it felt good to. She pressed her knuckle into the soil of the bird's nest fern, testing its depth. Still damp from yesterday. She would not water it tonight. She withdrew her hand and wiped it absently on her apron. The week which had pressed so insistently against her all evening seemed now to have moved several steps back. Ivy straightened slowly, picked up the mister, and moved on to the next pot. Ivy moved deeper into the conservatory, leaving the first bench behind her and entering the narrower corridor between the tall shelving units that lined both walls toward the back. Here the plants grew closer together, their fronds overlapping at the edges, and she had to turn slightly sideways in places to pass without disturbing them. The lamp's reach was thinner here, its amber warmth stretched and diffused, but her eyes had long since adjusted to the particular quality of this darkness. Green-grey and layered, full of small, distinct shapes she could identify without much looking. She stopped beneath the nearest hanging basket and lifted it gently by its coir rope, tilting it toward the faint light to examine the underside of the fronds. The habit was an old one. Pests preferred the undersides of leaves, sheltering in the humid shadow, where they went unnoticed longest. Ivy turned the basket a quarter rotation, checking each frond in turn. Nothing. The leaves were clean and slightly waxy, the color of deep water. She lowered the basket back to its hook and nudged it level with one finger. Further along, a mature Boston fern occupied most of a middle shelf, its arching fronds spilling over both sides of the pot. Ivy set down the mister and took up her small scissors from her apron pocket. 2 fronds near the base had dried to a pale brown, papery and dun. She clipped them cleanly at the stem, close and unhurried, and set them aside. The fern looked immediately better for it, or perhaps she simply felt that it did. Against the far wall, she paused to wipe the side of a brass watering can with the corner of her apron before lifting it. The brass had developed a soft patina over the years, no longer bright, but warm in color, the kind of warm that only came from long use. Ivy tipped a small measure of water into one pot, whose soil had pulled away slightly from the edges, a sure sign of dryness. She poured slowly and watched the water absorb before she set the can back down. It was the label that stopped her. A small rectangle of card tied to the pot with a length of string that had once been white but had faded to the color of old linen. The handwriting was her own, though younger, the letters more upright, less settled. She leaned in to read it without touching it, as though it was something that should be disturbed as little as possible. A memory came back to her, quiet and unhurried. A postcard, a coastal conservatory, afternoon light through glass. She smiled faintly, not with sadness. Outside, rain continued to move across the glass roof in long, uneven sweeps. but Ivy no longer registered it as weather, so much as texture, a background hum, a held note. It had become simply part of the room. She straightened, tucked a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear, and moved on to the next shelf. Ivy settled back onto the wooden stool and drew the nearest notebook from the stack at the bench's edge. It fell open across her lap with the ease of a book that knew it was often read, the spine soft, the cover worn pale at the corners. She found the current page, uncapped her pen, and wrote the date in the upper margin in her usual small hand. The entries came simply, without deliberation. A note on the moisture levels in the eastern pots, where the soil had dried a little more than she liked. A line about the 2 new fiddleheads she had found curled tight and promising near the base of the cinnamon fern. A brief observation marked with a small asterisk. A frond on the Japanese painted fern, whose tip had begun to curl inward in a way she wanted to track over the coming week. She wrote without hurry, each sentence settled and complete, before she began the next. When she had finished, she did not immediately close the notebook. Instead, her fingers found an earlier page and turned back to it, the way one turns back not to search for something, but simply to feel the distance traveled. The entries from past months passed beneath her thumb in small parcels. March, the long winter finally retreating. June, when the staghorn had put out a growth that surprised her. August, a note about humidity and a reminder to herself, written with mild exasperation, to order more sphagnum moss. Each line was a small proof of continuity. The conservatory tended and tended again. The same quiet attention accumulated into something that felt, now, like permanence. A soft sound came from the corner, the particular sound of Fig redistributing his weight on the folded blanket. Ivy glanced toward him without lifting her head. The old cat had turned slightly, and one amber eye opened, just enough to confirm her presence before drifting closed again. His tail moved once, slowly, and then was still. Ivy set the notebook aside and leaned down, reaching toward him with the back of her fingers. She scratched the top of his head gently, just behind the tipped ear, and felt him lean into it with the unhurried trust of the very old and very comfortable. He did not purr. He simply accepted it, as though her hand were part of the room. She straightened and reached for her mug. The chamomile had gone nearly cool, but she drank it anyway, finishing it in 2 slow sips. The warmth it carried was faint now, more sensation than heat, but it completed something, the way a final line completes a paragraph. Ivy rested the empty mug on the bench and set the notebook flat beside it. She laid her palm across the cover for a moment, feeling the worn cloth beneath her hand, the slight give of pages pressed together. The lamp held steady. Rain moved across the glass in long, loose ribbons. Outside, the night was dark and wet and entirely untroubling. She left her hand where it was, in no hurry to move. Ivy made one final round of the conservatory, moving along the row of newly tended pots with her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She was not looking for problems. She simply wanted to confirm that everything had been seen to, that nothing had been overlooked in the slow, easy drift of the evening. Each pot sat where it belonged. Each frond held its shape. She paused at the maidenhair, which had already begun to look slightly more assured in its repotted home, and allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction before moving on. At the potting bench, she returned the mister to its hook and set the pruning scissors back in their shallow wooden tray. Blades together, handle facing out. She did not think about these actions as she performed them. Her hands simply knew where things went, and the knowing was its own kind of comfort. She lifted her mug from the bench and found barely a swallow remaining. A thin, pale ring of chamomile. Ivy finished it without ceremony, tilting the mug until the last cool trace of it touched her lips, then set it back down with a quiet click against the wood. For a moment she stood without purpose, which was a different thing entirely from standing without peace. Then Ivy settled again onto the low wooden stool and let her hands rest open in her lap. It was only then, in the absence of any task to perform, that she noticed the rain had changed. The drumming that had greeted her at the door hours ago, that steady percussion across the curved glass roof, had shifted into something finer and less insistent. Not silence, not yet, but a softening, the way a held breath becomes a sigh. The drops were smaller now, or falling further apart, or both. She could not have said precisely when it had happened. The storm had simply been loosening its grip by degrees, and she had been too occupied to witness it. Ivy tilted her head back slightly and listened. The sound moved across the glass in gentle, irregular waves. No longer a drum roll, but something more like the last pages of a book being turned. She watched a single droplet appear at the high curve of the roof pane nearest the lamp and trace a slow, wavering path downward, catching the amber light for a moment before disappearing into the dark below the frame. Something in her chest settled at the sight of it. Ivy exhaled, a long, unhurried breath that came from somewhere deep and tired, and felt her shoulders drop in a way they had not managed all evening. Not the careful easing she had worked out earlier, but a true release, as though a small, stubborn weight had finally been set down. Fig slept on, undisturbed, his striped flank rising and falling in the faint warmth of the corner. The lamp held its amber circle. The glass held the fading rain. The room held Ivy, quietly and without condition, the way a room can when it has been loved long enough to know how. Ivy set the mug down. The sound it made against the wooden bench was small and final, a soft ceramic click that seemed, in the deep quiet of the conservatory, to mark something. The last task, the last gesture. There was nothing left to do, and, for once, no part of her reached for something to fill the gap. She settled back on the stool and folded her hands loosely in her lap. The amber lamp burned steadily above her, its circle of warmth falling across the potting bench, the closed notebooks, the neatly hung tools. Beyond its reach, the conservatory had deepened into layered shapes and shadows, the ferns dissolving slowly into the dark, their fronds no longer individual leaves, but soft, overlapping silhouettes stacked against the glass. She let her gaze move across them without focusing. There was nothing to examine now. They were simply there, as they always were, green and breathing and still. A small sound came from the corner. Fig lifted his head from the folded blanket, one tipped ear angled faintly in Ivy's direction. His amber eyes opened halfway, caught the lamp for a moment, and found her. He held the look for a few unhurried seconds. Not a question, not concern, simply the ancient animal acknowledgement of a presence known and trusted. Then he tucked his nose back beneath the curl of his tail and resettled, his striped flank rising once in a long breath before going slack again. Ivy watched him until his breathing slowed. Then the rain came once more, a last light run of it, barely more than a whisper across the high glass. It moved from one end of the roof to the other, like a single, unhurried thought, thin and trailing. And then it was gone. The gutters caught what remained and carried it away in a faint, diminishing trickle that ran a little longer than the rain itself, then went quiet. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Ivy looked up toward the dark panes above her. The glass was still faintly wet, the last moisture clinging in slow, formless shapes that caught no particular light. The storm had finished what it came to do. So, she felt, had she. Ivy closed her eyes, not with effort, not with the deliberate intention of resting or the anxious hope of sleep, simply because there was nothing left that required them to be open. The warmth of the lamp reached her through her closed lids as a faint amber pulse. The smell of the room was around her completely. Cool earth and green stems, and the faint chamomile still drifting from the empty mug. Somewhere within the glass walls, a fern frond shifted against another with the softest possible sound, like a page turning in a book no one was reading aloud. Ivy did not move. The conservatory held the night. The night held the house. The house held nothing that needed her now. She breathed in. She breathed out. The lamp glowed on, small and faithful, and Ivy rested.